Before I came to Chamberlain, I spent a couple of weeks at Holden Village out in the state of Washington in the Cascade Mountains. One of the resource persons that was there when I was at Holden was a humorist, storyteller from Canada by the name of Ralph Milton. I subscribed to his E magazine for a few years, and this was a couple of the stories he told based on our gospel text this morning, and I'd like to read them to you this morning. He writes, "There's a flower bed in front of our house. Last fall I got some manured bark mulch to put around the roots of the roses to protect them during the winter. Well, it was an easy winter. This spring I took the contents of last year's compost bin, a whole year's worth of garden clippings and kitchen scraps, and spread them on the front bed. Did I forget I'd done that, or was I simply having a mental lapse? Anyway, I spread some chemical fertilizer on the bed also. A week later, when I was spreading fertilizer on the lawn, the spreader threw a nice layer of that onto the bed for good measure. Well, things are growing well in my front flower bed. As in, stand aside, folks. It's growing time. The roses are sending up great long sprouts with small flowers on the top and big thorns all the way down each long stalk. On the other hand, some of the other perennials have died, but the daisies, straight up, 5 feet tall, on spindly stalks, and of course with the first breeze, over they went. I tried stalking and tying, but they looked really weird. So I finally picked my way through those threatening roses and cut them down. I only got 3 serious scratches from the roses. And the moral of the story, boys and girls, is that too much of a good thing is too much of a good thing. We once had neighbors who were a bit like those over-fertilized daisies. They had moved to the Okanagan Valley from somewhere on the prairies. They had sold a big farm, and suddenly they found themselves quite literally to be millionaires. So they bought stuff. A motorcycle first, another car, a big, huge, fancy one, a couple of horses, a huge motorhome, which I found myself sniffing at because it cost more than our house. They were forever going shopping and hauling things into their house. They never used most of that stuff. When our electric frying pan quit, they gave us one. We have 3, they said. None of those vehicles ever left their yard. They mostly sat around because they hired people to come and do any work that needed doing. After years of hard work on the farm, they were not going to lift a finger. No, sir. They were bored. They had no real friends. They did nothing they enjoyed except watch TV and eat. And they got fat, both of them, balloons. Within 3 years of moving to our beautiful valley, both of them were dead, like my daisies, like the man in the passage from Luke. Such a waste of God-given lives. Too much can sometimes be worse than too little. We have an interesting parable of Jesus, one that is as appropriate for us living in the 21st century as it was to the Jews living in the 1st century. As we look at this parable, many times Christians will say, or at least will feel guilty, that maybe they have too much, or maybe that they shouldn't save up for retirement. I don't think that's the point of this parable. I don't think Jesus is telling us not to be prudent with what God has given us, that we should set aside some for retirement. In fact, there's another story in the Bible where Joseph in Egypt did exactly that. He stored up the abundance for the time when there would be a drought and extra food would be needed. And I don't think Jesus is speaking against having wealth, being prosperous. After all, the early Jews would have seen this as a blessing from God. And I don't think there is anything wrong with having money. Because we look at this parable, the man in this parable asked the right question, but he answered it in the wrong way. The question he asked was, now that I have gotten this overabundance of a harvest, what should I do? Great question. What should I do when I have this overabundance? Unfortunately, he answered it the wrong way. And so how do we answer this question? What is the right answer to this important question? And I believe there are two correct answers, which I would like to look at this morning. And the first answer is, thank God. Give praise to God because you have been so wonderfully blessed. As we look at this parable, he was concerned only about himself. One scholar has mentioned he literally worshipped the Trinity, me, myself, and I. Listen again. What should I do? I have no place to store my crops. I will do this. I will pull down my barns. I will build larger ones. I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, all centered on himself, worshiping me, myself, and I, rather than giving God the credit for the blessings that he had received. The abundance of the crop was provided by God, and yet somehow he was unwilling and unable to give God the credit. I wrote in my email devotion, which I finally was able to send out yesterday because I was at grandparents' camp for the first part of the week. And I mentioned how last spring, after a dry winter and a dry year last year, I really was afraid that this coming summer would be a hot, dry one with very little moisture. Much to my surprise, and the surprise of many other farmers that I have talked to, that was not the case. God has literally blessed us over these last 4 months with an abundance of moisture. I enjoy driving around the state, and I've driven in almost every part of the state except for the northwestern part. And I've just been amazed at the crop, especially the corn this year. The only part of the state that really is still in drought is the extreme southwest corner. If we don't, in South Dakota, get a record harvest of corn crop this year, I'll be very, very surprised. And yet, I fear that is there going to be the thankfulness shown to God that should be this year? Will farmers and business people who reap and benefit from farmers when they receive a huge harvest offer God the thanks and praise that God deserves? I believe this moisture has been really an unexpected blessing that God has given to us. And we have the choice to offer God our thanks and praise, or to worship our own Trinity, me, myself, and I, and thank ourselves because our efforts were not in vain, and all of the work that we put into it has resulted in a good harvest. Answering the question is important. And the first way that we are expected to answer the question correctly is to offer thanks and praise to God. What am I to do when we are blessed so abundantly? Simply give God the thanks and praise that God has blessed us in such an abundant way. I think the second way, and the correct way to answer this, is simply give some of it away. When God has provided an excess of abundance to you, then share some of it. And we see nothing in this parable of Jesus that he, the farmer, was ever interested in sharing any. That certainly was the case with this couple that retired in Canada. No interest in sharing it. I can't help but think if they would have taken some of the money they spent on themselves and used a little bit to help others in need, it would have brought them some joy, some purpose in life, rather than simply sitting around getting fat and dying. You know, the topic of possessions, of wealth, and of generosity is a topic that is important to Luke, more so than any of the other gospel writers. And I know people get, especially Christians, criticize churches because all they want is asking for more money. And yet as we look at Luke's gospel, this is one of the themes of Luke's gospel. He addresses this issue of being rich and what happens when God has provided abundance for us. On Monday, as I mentioned, we were at grandparents' camp. And the Bible study for Monday dealt with Zacchaeus. Only Luke has that story of Zacchaeus. And right at the beginning of the story, we are told he was a very wealthy man. Jesus invites himself to Zacchaeus' house, and Zacchaeus decides, because of his encounter with Christ, to share some of his wealth. Not all of it. I don't think Jesus is ever expecting us to give all of it away, but rather to be a little generous when God has blessed us abundantly. And here we hear of Zacchaeus giving some of his wealth to help the poor. And Jesus says Zacchaeus is blessed because of that. There's another story that appears only in Luke's gospel where the opposite happens. And that's the story of the rich man and Lazarus. Here was this poor man laying at the front of Lazarus' house, and Lazarus doesn't see him or ignores him. He hopes to get just a scrap, a little bit of food from the rich man's table. The dogs ate more than he did, and yet he was completely ignored, and nothing was shared with this man who needed so much. And of course, we're told that this man ended in Hades. Again, this story, this parable that Jesus tells of the rich man who built the barns, the rich farmer who built the barns, a story only again that appears in Luke's gospel. So Luke is very concerned. He's not saying that it's wrong to be rich. What's wrong is to think about only yourselves and not use the resources, the possessions, the blessings that God has given to each of us to share with those who have little or none. We are going to participate in Holy Communion this morning. And again, there is emphasis here in Holy Communion that Jesus feeds us with the bread of life. That Jesus comes and gives of himself totally in this meal. And then we as Christians are to take that bread of life that Christ has given to us and share it with others who have little or none. I think there's a direct tie in here of sharing our possessions, of answering the question in the correct way. As we look at this parable this morning, the man asked the correct question. What should I do now that God has blessed me with a great abundance of crop? And the answers that he gave was wrong. He simply hoarded what he had gotten, building up more barns, and taking life easy. Jesus says that's the wrong answer. The correct answer is, first of all, give thanks to God. Praise God for what God has given you, the blessings that you have received. And then second, be willing to share some of that abundance with those who have little or none. Amen.